For those that maybe didn't catch it, I posted a video last night from my most recent chess stream, and suffice to say, it was not my best games by far. I ended up playing quite poorly. I actually put like a warning at the beginning of the video, just letting people know, hey, if you're watching this channel, just, be aware that these games get really bad, and so if you don't want to suffer through it, like, don't turn back now. But I would think about that more this morning. The idea of sort of playing bad. The idea of just taking a very long time to become good at something. And for me, I am just perpetually one of the slowest learners. I think that maybe is out there. The amount of time that I spend in like that very beginner stage, it seems like it's more than the average person. It seems like it definitely takes me a lot longer than probably the average person to sort of become just basically competent at something. And sort of the slow learning process, it makes really anything very, very challenging. And the more I look at my own writing now, the more apparent that is. I'm not really sure how long it takes someone to actually become, skilled as a writer. Obviously, you're never going to be, so someone eventually becomes the greatest writer of a generation because there has to be a best writer, but it's subjective, and you're never really not going to stop learning. Like you're continually trying to get better each book, each thing you write, you're always trying to be better. But so I'm not sure how long it takes someone, though, to get to that stage, like that stage where you are decent and competent at it. I remember it was, I think it took me like almost 4 years, basically, maybe 4 or 5 years before I would consider myself to be competent, that I could just write something and have it not be terrible. That's probably closer to it's a pretty accurate assessment. If I started taking it seriously in 2015 writing, and basically like I was accepted into an MFA program back, I think, in 2019 maybe? No, maybe 2018. So yeah, 3-4 years of writing basically to get myself to maybe a competent level. That's, I think, a pretty slow progression. I could be wrong. I don't know. To be honest, I have no idea if that's slow or not. For me, it feels slow. But looking at where I am now compared to, 4 years now since even that, I'm definitely better, but there's still all those sort of things where it's like you're better, but not astronomically better, right? And that's often, I think, really the challenge with the whole process is just that, it just takes forever to get good at something. And unfortunately, if you're someone like me who maybe takes longer just as a human being, just as someone, just at your cognitive level, it takes you longer to acquire a skill, the longer that process is going to be in addition to that. I suppose the one good thing, I guess the one nice thing, the one good thing that I have noticed is that the longer it takes you to become competent as a beginner, the better foundation you have long term. And that's one thing that I often tell myself is just that mentality of, it takes you longer to get to this position, but once you're there, you have a more solid foundation. It's like when you're when you play football when you're a kid, and maybe if I'm sure people can relate to this. You're in say you're in middle school and you're trying out for the football team, and you never get put in, right? You're one of those kids that's underdeveloped in the sense that all the other kids in your class, they've already gone through puberty, they're already getting bigger. They're bigger and larger than you, and they're getting all the play time because they can score the points because they have sort of the athletic prowess, right? They're just by the virtue of the fact that they've had their growth spurts, they put on been able to put on that muscle and that size a lot earlier than you. They get the play time. So what happens is you're off doing basically drills with the practice squad all day, and what happens is then you go from middle school to high school, and maybe you make the, maybe you try for the JV team, and maybe eventually, your sophomore year, maybe you get on the JV team, and you start getting, play time, and all of a sudden you're the guy, right? It happens all the time where you see, it's kind of crazy, but it happens all the time, I think, where you see the kids that are really big stars, in middle school, all of a sudden they get to high school and you don't really hear about them. You see the kids that were on the practice squad all of a sudden taking over. The reason for that is the guys that were in, middle school, basically, that were on the practice squad, all they were doing was drills. They were building the skill. They hadn't gone through puberty. They haven't, got the size yet the other kids got, but they spent 3 years doing drills instead of being in the game, just doing drills. So when they finally started going through puberty, when they started getting bigger and larger and started being of the same size as you, they had the skill on top of that. I think it's the same thing for people that maybe are slow learners, especially in writing, where, it might take you, the 3, 4 years, 5 years maybe to become a competent writer. But by the time you are one, you spent so much time at the beginner level studying things like sentences, reading. You spend so much time focusing on kind of on the craft that once you finally get to that point where you're able to overcome sort of your last hurdle, that last lack of skill that was holding you back, you have such a skilled foundation in the other areas of your writing that you can start basically going much further. You can start writing, books and potentially short stories that maybe might start getting published, as opposed to the guy or gal who maybe in the first couple of years, maybe they all of a sudden, they get published, right? I knew someone who got published by a small indie publisher within like a year of starting to write. Like, they decided they want to become a writer. Within 1 year, they'd written a book and found an indie publisher because they were very good at crafting a voice, and they were very good at sort of just keeping the ball rolling. Like it was something, basically the story was very fast paced. It had a strong voice, and the premise was interesting. It was just an very interesting premise for a story, and so this indie publisher picked it up, and the book was it was okay, but since that time, it's been a few years now, their work hasn't gotten any better. They have not improved. It's still that work. So it's something where, initially they sort of had this kind of like initial good skill, and they were able to hone on these couple key areas of their writing that got them, the initial small publisher there. But they haven't grown beyond that. And the reason why is they weren't putting in the reps early on to develop the other areas like description, and sort of characterization, and sort of going deeper with, basically the stories, and understanding, certain more advanced techniques like how to weave scene and summary, how to use like motif, how to show subtext and all that. Like, their works don't really contain that. Their works, just this example, this person, it doesn't, it's not really at that level. Just because they got the initial success and they figured, all right, I'm at this level now and I'm just going to coast this level. There's an element of just being okay where you're at and not putting in the effort to go beyond that. And so what I guess kind of the point I'm trying to get to is that the longer you spend at the beginner stage, obviously don't try and stay there. Try to move up as fast as possible, if you can, but developing in the beginning stage, it allows you to give you that sort of well-rounded foundation. And I think that's one thing that perhaps has helped my writing the most, is just the fact that I spent so much time in that beginner stage, so much of that, writing this mediocre, this crap writing. And now at the point where, all right, so for the first, for the first 5, 6 years, something like that, the first 5, 6, 7 years, whatever it was, I was struggling, and then all of a sudden, in that 6th, 7th year, my writing all of a sudden shot up, and now I potentially have a publishing deal here on the line. Maybe, fingers crossed, who knows? But the point is, my work got better very quickly. It sort of jumped rather quickly from that beginner to more of the intermediate competent stage now, where something maybe can get published, just because I spent so many years in that early stages there. And so if you yourself are someone that also is a very slow learner, I would say take stock in that. Take stock in the fact that you will potentially build a foundation for yourself over the long term. And really persistence is all that's holding you back from that. Like, if you still persist, if you still go at something every single day, you're going to eventually get better. The only way you couldn't get better is if you're training the wrong things. Like if you keep making the same errors over again, and you keep repeating the same errors, then at this point you're just training bad habits, which is often why I talk about, being very conscious about what you put down in your first drafts, because I don't want people fast drafting, putting down these really kind of mediocre sentences and developing this prose that's not very skillful, and then just ingraining the habit of doing that over and over again, because you're training bad habits. You're just training yourself you're training yourself on bad prose. So that's obviously something to be aware of. But otherwise, as long as you persist at something, you're going to eventually get better. And generally, the person that gets better over the long term is the person that suffers the most in the beginning. One final analogy. If anyone ever trains in the martial arts, there's a concept called the uke, or the uke. Basically, that's the person that the master will demonstrate a technique on. You see all the time in videos where a master demonstrates a technique, or when people in the class perform a technique on like the bad guy or their opponent. That person that's their opponent that sort of stands there or throws the punch or takes the throw, whatever. That's called the uke. That person that's the uke is usually, not always, but is usually in the beginning the worst fighter. They're usually the person that's picked from the class because they're not necessarily the best. They're not necessarily the best fighter, the most offensive. But what happens is part of the reason why they're picked is the uke eventually becomes the best fighter in the dojo. If you go to any dojo and ask, you always say, the uke becomes the best, because they know what it's like to have the move done to them, so they understand the effect of the move. They also experience basically the takedown of the move or the strike of the move, so they know they're developing basically the muscle memory of also practicing, the strikes and the throws and having it done to them. They're practicing muscle memory, but they're also learning mechanics in a way that the person that doesn't take the move can't learn them. So if you repeatedly learn the mechanics of the move, you know how to do it yourself. You know what it's supposed to feel like. You develop that sort of muscle memory. And what happens is eventually, after like a decade, the uke ends up beating everybody in the dojo. It's the same thing, I think, with writing. The person that sort of suffers a lot in the beginning and develops their skill in that beginner stage for a very long time, you eventually become the best. As long as you practice, deliberately and with, a good sense of kind of conscious awareness of what you're doing. You practice, with that sort of deep work type of mentality. Whew. So this was my bit of a long one, but I hope that point comes across. And really, it seems like the whole point of making this video, honestly, it just seems like I'm trying to reassure myself in a way when it comes to my chess playing. Just because, man, that play from last night, that one really got to me. So hopefully I've reassured myself a bit too. But yeah, if you're someone that is going through the process and you are a slow learner like myself, embrace that. Embrace the fact that you're working on the fundamentals early, because I really do think that, in half a decade, 15 years, you will have a skill that will be, top of the line.